I don't know how many of you were here at the first shiur that I gave on the Rambam, but it was basically an overview of his life and his works. And today I would like to start with looking at what the Rambam actually wrote. We talked about the Rambam and we saw some sources, but I think what's most important is to read what the Rambam actually wrote. Now, I mentioned last time that he wrote in two languages. He wrote in Arabic and he wrote in Hebrew. His Perush HaMishnah he wrote in Arabic, and that was translated more than once. Most recently was Rav Kapach, who retranslated the entire Perush HaMishnah into Hebrew, and Rav Shilat from Ma'ale Adumim also translated parts of the Perush HaMishnah, mainly the introductions, the three introductions to the Perush HaMishnah, and I think he did a slightly better job, although I don't know Arabic, so I can't judge completely, but it seems clearer. The Mishnah Torah, the Rambam wrote in Hebrew, so this is what we're going to see is his original Hebrew, no translation. It's directly what he wrote, and he wrote in a very, very elegant Hebrew. His Hebrew style is madhim, as they say in Hebrew. As a matter of fact, he set a new standard for the Hebrew language, particularly in the Middle Ages when Hebrew was not really spoken. It was basically a literary language, but he wrote in a clear and elegant Hebrew. And that's one of the amazing things about the Mishnah Torah, about which we'll speak about in more expanded terms today. Then his other major work, we mentioned some of his other works, but we're not going to talk about them now. There was the Moreh Nevuchim. The Moreh Nevuchim, he returned to Arabic, and the reason for that was that most of those who would understand his philosophical discussions would understand them in Arabic. And the Rambam also claimed that there wasn't enough Hebrew to express his philosophical ideas in Hebrew. So he wrote it in Arabic. Had he tried, he would have created a Hebrew language, a Hebrew philosophical language, which he left for his translators, which was Shmuel ibn Tibon, during his lifetime, actually. Shmuel ibn Tibon translated the Moreh Nevuchim during the Rambam's lifetime. I may have mentioned it at the last meeting. And then in modern times, it's been retranslated once, twice, and now a third time. Just in the last 40 years or so, Rav Kapach retranslated the Moreh Nevuchim into Hebrew, and then Michal Schwartz, I think, upped him one and did a better translation into Hebrew, a clearer Hebrew. And then most recently, Yochai Makbili put out a 3-volume Moreh Nevuchim. The last volume just came out about 2 or 3 months ago, which I think went one step better than what Michal Schwartz did, not only in terms of its clarity, but in terms of extensive commentary and annotation as well. It's a 3-volume book, and anybody interested in the Moreh Nevuchim, it makes it, I wouldn't say it makes it accessible, it makes it more accessible than it had been in the past. So in any case, we're going to see the Rambam's Hebrew. Now, we said a few things about the Mishnah Torah last time, and maybe I'll be repeating it, but the Mishnah Torah is basically the most magnificent halachic work ever written to this very day. It has not been superseded. The magnificence of it lies in its comprehensiveness. Nobody else tried to paskin halacha in Kol HaTorah Kula. In other words, there's no area of halacha that the Rambam did not include. And that's not the case, for example, the Turim and the Shulchan Aruch, which limited itself to more practical areas of halacha. And the Rambam felt that if you bifurcate the halacha and you leave out parts, then you're missing often certain concepts and ways of thinking in the parts that are practical, and therefore a comprehensive view of halacha is very important. And there are a number of other important aspects of the Mishnah Torah, and if we have an opportunity to meet again, we'll continue and develop those elements as well. I want to start with the Rambam's introduction to Mishnah Torah. Now, you may say, why are you going to start with introduction? The truth of the matter is that in the Torah there are no introductions. In the Gemara there are no introductions. Right? The Gemara starts right away with Hilchos Kriyas Shema, right? Without any introduction, without telling you where they're coming from. The whole concept of writing an introduction to a work actually developed in the Middle Ages. Firstly, in the times of the Gaonim. The first great man to write introductions was Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon wrote introductions to his works. Incidentally, introductions initially were mainly characteristic of Bavel and then of Spanish Jewry until the expulsion. In Ashkenaz, they didn't write introductions. Rashi didn't write an introduction to his Perush al Torah. The Balei Tosfos didn't write an introduction to their commentaries. You don't have introductions in Ashkenaz. You have them essentially in Sfard. And the introductions are very important because they give you an overview of what the author intends to do, or very often it's the reverse. It gives you an overview of what the author intended to do after you write it. Very often people write their introductions at the end. After they finished it, then they write the introduction. But it's not always so. And an interesting exercise is to line up the expectations that you have from the introduction with the actual carrying out of the project. In any case, the Rambam wrote introductions to all his works. He wrote the introduction to the Perush HaMishnah. He wrote 3 introductions to the Perush HaMishnah. He wrote introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim. He wrote an introduction to the Mishnah Torah. He wrote an introduction to his Sefer HaMitzvos, which is very important and which even affects what we're going to see now in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah. But we can't do everything, so we'll just limit ourselves. And in each of them, he has certain ideas, certain methodological issues that he wants you to see, which are important for understanding what he's actually doing. Basically, what you have in the Hakdama to the Mishnah Torah is a history of Torah Sheba'al Peh. For the Rambam, it was very important to lay out the groundwork of where did this all come from. For the Rambam, it was particularly important because the Mishnah Torah did not give any sources. All of the Mishnah Torah is stated without reference to where in the Gemara, from where in the Gemara it was taken, which of the Tanoim of the Amoraim said it, nothing. In other words, every halacha in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is presented stam. And the Rambam defends that by saying, well, I've laid out in my introduction the whole Shalshelet HaKabbalah of the Avos, of the Tanaim, and the Amoraim, and the Godim. That's all set out in my introduction. So you should know that everything I write is taken from there and is related to there. The Ravid, who was the Rambam's major critic, didn't like that. In the introduction, in a Hasaga, the Ravid has a Hasaga on the Hakdama to the to the Mishnah Torah, and he says, who does he think he is? You have to remember, when the Ravid when the Rambam published his Mishnah Torah, he was 40 years old. The Ravid at the time was 70 years old, and he was considered the outstanding Gaon of the time. So now we have a senior Gaon looking at a new halachic work of some upstart there sitting in Egypt, coming from Spain, and now I have to evaluate this. The Ravid was very critical, but he wasn't always critical. Everybody has the image of the Ravid attacking the Rambam, but he doesn't only do that. He supports the Rambam as well. And when the Rambam needs a source, sometimes he presents a source. And when the Rambam needs support, he'll give him his support, all according to his own halachic judgment. In other words, the Ravid was very independent, and he didn't see himself having to abide by what the Rambam said. And he critically, but really critically read, critically in the positive sense. He very critically read every single halacha, and going into great depth of how did the Rambam come to this conclusion? Is this a right conclusion from the Talmudic sources? And if it's not, then the Ravid presents his criticism. So it's the first major book review of the Mishnah Torah that came out. There were many others, and that's a story in itself which we won't go into right now. In any case, since the Rambam was so brief in the Mishnah Torah, he felt it necessary to present the Masoret, the Shalshelet HaKabbalah that you find in Chazal, and it relates to his entire conception of the nature of Torah, number one. And the end of this introduction is very important for seeing his own self-image of what he intended to do in Mishnah Torah. Towards the end of the introduction, he basically lays out what are my goals, what are my intentions, what is the configuration of this new book that I'm presenting to you. So it's a fascinating document. It's a fascinating, almost autobiographical document of the Rambam, where he, towards the end, reflects on what he's doing. He's reflecting on why he had to do it. So as a record of the tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and as of a record of the Rambam's own self-awareness, this Hakdama is very important. At the end of the Hakdama, and I'm not sure that we'll get to it today, the Rambam lays out the structure of Mishnah Torah. And that in itself is a fascinating construction. And here, what's important when we get to that is to compare how the Rambam built the Mishnah Torah into 14 sections, and how that relates to the Mishnah, which was divided only into 6 sections. And why the Rambam saw it necessary to change the whole configuration of the halacha from 6 sections, and those were divided into Masechta, to 14 books were divided into sections of halacha. But that we should get to soon. Let's start with the text itself. Let's read. We'll comment on it and reflect on what the Rambam is saying. So first of all, he opens with a pasuk from Tehillim. Az lo evosh behabiti el kol mitzvotecha. Okay? I will not be embarrassed when I present before you all of the mitzvot. Now, there's one important word in this pasuk here, as far as the Rambam is concerned, and that word is, what's the most important word for the Rambam here in that pasuk? No. What? No. Call. The Rambam here is taking a pasuk that talks about kol mitzvotecha. In other words, right? And by the way, every time the Rambam uses a pasuk, you got to listen for the perush that he's giving to the pasuk. The Rambam was incredibly original in the way he used psukim all through his works. In Mishnah Torah, very often he'll bring proofs from a pasuk that never appears in Shas. And all of a sudden, the Rambam will introduce a pasuk that he sees as relevant to this specific halacha, to this specific context, And it's a fascinating study. Whenever you come across a pasuk in the Rambam's writings, stop and think. What is he trying to tell you here? What's the message that he sees in this pasuk, and what is it committing? What is it telling you? So here, there's no question about it that he saw the word kol mitzotecha, because this is what he's doing. He's writing a book which paskins halacha in all the mitzvot. And what he did, as I mentioned the last time, what he did before he wrote Mishnah Torah, he wrote his Sefer HaMitzvot. The Sefer HaMitzvot, which lists all Taryag mitzvot, the Rambam wrote before he wrote Mishnah Torah. And the reason that he wrote a Sefer HaMitzvot, by the way, it's one of the first Sefer HaMitzvot that was written. It's really the first major Sefer HaMitzvot that was written. In other words, the first Sefer that listed from 1 to 613 what are all the mitzvot d'oraita. Not only did he do that, by the way, he prefaced the Sefer HaMitzvot with a methodological introduction in which explained on what basis do I determine that a specific pasuk in the Torah relates to a mitzvah d'oraisa. And that's a very, very complicated area. We're not going to go into it here, but the Rambam defended himself. In other words, he set out 14 principles that establish on what basis did I pick these 613, because you know that there's not a universal agreement of what's included in the Taryag mitzvos. The Rambam has his shita, the Ramban has his shita, the Abarbanel has his shita, and there's many other shitos about what are the 613 mitzvot. Not major differences, but there's a good number of debates about specific mitzvot. One of the major commentators on the Rambam Sefer Mitzvot was the Ramban. The Ramban was born just before the Rambam died. In other words, they're separated by 2 generations. And the Rambam wrote Hasagos not only on the entire Sefer Mitzvot, but also on the principles, on the Rambam's principles. And there, he often completely disagreed. The Ramban was a very independent halachic thinker. A very independent thinker, independent and original. As a matter of fact, people like to compare Rambam and Ramban because their names sound so similar. And the truth of the matter is, there's an important basis and contrast to talk about the Rambam and the Ramban. I'll digress for a second. Both of them wrote halachic works of great importance, but of a completely different type. The Rambam wrote Psak Halacha. The Ramban wrote commentaries on the Talmud. He wrote Chidushim on the Talmud. In other words, their whole approach to how to deal with the halachic content of the Torah was completely different. The Ramban was influenced by the Balei HaTosfot. As a matter of fact, originally Spain and France, or Sfarad and Ashkenaz, were 2 completely separate entities in terms of Jewish culture. But around the time of the Ramban, there comes to an interpenetration between them, and the Ramban studied with Balei HaTosfot, came back to Spain, and used the methodology of the Balei HaTosfot, but he wrote a running commentary which along the lines of the Balei HaTosfot, but it wasn't pointed, but he went and continued, discussed in great depth the halacha. So you have 2 great halachic scholars whose style is completely different. Their styles are completely different. You have the Rambam and the Ramban. Now, second, they were both great thinkers, both great and original thinkers, both the Rambam and the Ramban. But their areas, their methodology of thought were worlds apart. The Rambam was a rationalist, and his sources originated in Greek philosophy as they were translated into Torah thought, but it's very clearly based upon rational thinking. The Ramban was the first major gadol to introduce Kabbalah into Jewish thinking. Until the Ramban, Kabbalah was the area of a very few select individuals. You had very small groups of Mekubalim, and that was it. It didn't go beyond that. And in the middle of the 13th century, there was almost a revolution in which Kabbalah burst out of this confines of small groups and began to enter the marketplace. What the Ramban did, he introduced Kabbalah into his Perush ala Torah. Now his Perush ala Torah was intended for a wide public, but he put Kabbalah into that Perush ala Torah. However, he was a little concerned that putting Kabbalah into a Perush ala Torah, it might go, people may misinterpret it or misunderstand it. So he warned people, if you're not a Kabbalist, skip those parts. Don't deal with them. They're very difficult. If that's the case, then why Bichlal did he put it into the Perush ala Torah? What the Ramban wanted to do is to let you know that it's not Aristotelian rationalism, as the Rambam thought, is the basis for Jewish thought. It's the traditional Kabbalah which is the basis. Now, if you really want to know it, then you'll have to delve more deeply in it, but you should know that it's an integral part of understanding the Torah. You can't understand the Torah, according to the Ramban, without really knowing Kabbalah. So both of them are major thinkers and both original. In other words, you can take a dozen or 24 topics of Jewish thought and contrast what the Rambam said and what the Ramban said. Not only that, but in a third area as well. Both of them were major Jewish communal leaders, and they took strong stands, and they protected Am Yisrael in all kinds of situations. And the Rambam's famous Igros are the sign of his, and the Ramban's involvement in two major historical events are evident. With the Rambam, he wrote the Geret Hashmad to help the Jews in Morocco at the time who were subject to forced conversions, and he strengthened them. He wrote the Geret Teiman. Let me just close this. I'm sorry. Just a second. He wrote the Igeret Teiman, helping the Jews who were persecuted because of a false Messiah, and he also wrote the Igeret Chiyat HaMeitim, and plus many other letters and correspondences. The Ramban was involved in two major Jewish communal events that were critical. First was after the Rambam died, there were those who felt that going into areas of philosophy may be dangerous. And there was a strong opposition, particularly in Ashkenaz at the time, in the 1230s and the 1240s, there was opposition to what the Rambam did, to the extent that a group of Chachamim in northern France went to the church authorities and complained to them that the Rambam is a heretic in Christian terms. And then they went ahead and collected all the copies of the Moreh Nevuchim in Paris, and they burnt them at the stake. Except that they didn't, that wasn't enough for them. They said, as long as we were burning Jewish books, let's go ahead and burn the entire Talmud, which is, they did a couple of years later. The Ramban, even though he disagreed with the Rambam on major areas of Jewish thought, wrote a very, very strong letter defending the Rambam and basically asserting his ultimate importance in Jewish life. And that letter changed the whole self-image of the Rambam until the very day. Until the 1230s and 1240s, people felt okay about attacking the Rambam. Once the Ramban defended the Rambam, he was never attacked again by Jews. People disagreed with it. Okay, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing, but that brought to the end the almost visceral attack against the Rambam that was developing at the beginning of the 13th century. That was his first, and he accomplished what he set out to do, the Ramban. And the second event of the Ramban is the debate in Barcelona. The king demanded that the Jews come to a public debate against the Catholic authorities of the time, where the Catholic authorities claimed. Now they didn't say we want to convince you to convert to Christianity. What the topic of the debate was that we want to show you that the rabbis of the Talmud believed in Christianity. That was the purpose of the debate. And the Ramban was called on to defend Judaism. And that was a major story, and that is a 4 or 5 part lecture in itself, but we won't go into it. So these are two the parallels between the Rambam and the Ramban on every level, both of them outstanding Jewish thinkers, leaders, halachic scholars, each one with completely different styles, which is a very interesting event. Okay. Let's get back to our text. Az lo evosh v'habiti al kol mitzvotecha. Kol ha-mitzvot, the Rambam writes, shenitnu lo l'Moshe b'Sinai, b'feirusham nitnu. In other words, at Matan Torah, so the text, the first line. The second line, line 3. You got it? Line 3.
Line 3, huh?
We're on line 3. Kol ha-mitzvot shenitnu lo l'Moshe b'Sinai b'feirusham nitnu. In other words, the mitzvot were given not as only as they were written in the Torah, but they were given. Yeah, okay. Kol ha-mitzvot shenitnu lo l'Moshe b'Sinai b'feirusham nitnu. When the Torah was given in Har Sinai, it was given not only the mitzvah itself, it was given with its interpretation, with its oral interpretation. And then he brings a pasuk, Shene'emar, ve'etna lecha et luchot ha'even ve'hatorah ve'hamitzvah. There are three words here. Luchot ha'even, which contained, number 1, Torah, and number 2, it contained mitzvah. What does that mean? So the Rambam explains. Torah, zo Torah shebichtav. That's the Chamisha Chumshei Torah that we have. U'mitzvah ze perusha, v'tzivanu lasot haTorah al pi hamitzvah, u'mitzvah zohi shenikret Torah shebal peh. We were commanded to observe the Torah according to the mitzvah. Mitzvah means Torah shebal peh. In other words, we got Torah shebiksav and Torah shebal peh. Okay, the Rambam is placing the very basic foundations of everything. We know this, but here the Rambam is formulating it in a very careful way. And incidentally, we'll see later, at a later point, the importance of the Rambam's identifying mitzvah with Torah shebal peh and what its implications are. That will come to later. Now, how did it get to us? So the next line 6. Kol ha-Torah ktava Moshe Rabbeinu kodem sheyamut. The Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the entire Torah before he died. Here, there's a machlokus in the Gemara whether Torah Megillah nitna or Torah Chatuma nitna. Was the Torah written over the course of the 40 years in the Midbar, or was the Torah written at the end as a sealed a book? Here, the Rambam seems to imply the latter. In other words, he wrote the entire Chamisha Chumshei Torah. He wrote them down before he died. B'ktav yado, right? He wrote it down in his own handwriting. V'natan sefer l'chol shevet v'shevet. He wrote it 13 times. He gave one to each shevet v'shevet. V'sefer echad netanahu ba'aron la'ed. And one version of the Torah was kept in the Aron, and that testified to the authenticity of the Torah. Yes?
Does the Rambam give a source for that there were 13 Torahs?
The Rambam doesn't give a source for anything. Yes. And for sources here, I mean, the Nosei Kelim of the Rambam are very good, but Rav Nachum Rabinovich, Alav Shalom, from Maleh Adumim, wrote a major commentary on the Mishnah Torah, Yad Pshuta, and he devoted one volume just to the Hakdama. Where he goes through every line and line, and then he discusses the sources for each statement and each. I was going to bring it with me; it slipped my mind, but it's a slimmer volume than the other ones. The one on Avaz, on Zmanim is like that. So the Hakdama is a little slip, but he goes through every line in the Hakdama, and he deals with the sources of those statements. So there are sources for all of them.
Why do you think that the Rambam gave no sources? There's got to be a reason for it.
Okay. We'll get to that at the end of the Hakdama. Okay. The Rambam says something which strongly implies why he wrote it in such a way and didn't want. There were certain ideological issues that were raised at the time, and in any case, we will get to that in Mirza Hashem.
All the 13 books were written by Moshe?
I'm sorry?
All the 13 books were written by Moshe?
That's what seems to be implied, yes. That's what he said, Biktav Yado v'natan sefer l'chol shevet v'shevet, which means that he wrote, and he wrote it out. There's a lot of work. We know how long a sofer takes to write a Sefer Torah, I guess.
They weren't in the copy machines those days.
That's correct. No copy, no scanning, no. That's correct. Okay, and he put one in the Aron Kodesh, Shenemar, and then he brings his biblical proof to that. Lakoach et Sefer HaTorah hazeh. Take this Torah, Sefer Torah, V'samtem oto mitzad Aron Brit Hashem Elokeichem. That's what the pasuk says. Put the Torah. In other words, this version of the written Torah, he said to Bnei Israel, put it in the Aron Kodesh next to the Luchot HaBrit. V'haya sham b'chal la'ed. And this will testify to the authenticity of the Torah. Okay. That's the Torah Shebechtav. V'ha mitzvah, line 9, v'ha mitzvah shehi perush haTorah lo ktava. However, the Torah Shebal Peh, the interpretation, that was not written down. And eventually we're going to have to discuss the ideology of not writing down Torah Shebal Peh, and of course what happened in the end that it was written down. Why it was written down, that will come to in this introduction, and that we'll discuss. We'll discuss that. Okay, so mitzvah shehi perush haTorah lo ktava ela tziva lazkenim b'nei Yoshua l'shar Yisrael. This he orally transmitted to Yehoshua and to the Zkenim, who transmitted it to all of Am Yisrael. Shenemar. Et kol hadavar asher anochi mitzav etchem oto tishmeru lasot. Everything that I am telling you now, you should be careful to fulfill. In other words, I am now commanding you. I'm telling you this now. I'm not writing it. You have a written text which serves as the basis, but I am adding now the interpretation now, and you have to remember it. Because it remained an oral tradition. It remained an oral tradition for thousands of years, and eventually it was written down in the 5th or 6th or perhaps even 7th century of the Common Era, and that's a separate issue that we'll discuss later. Okay. Even though the oral law was not written down, he taught it all orally. You have to remember that the ability to memorize what we have today is nothing like it was once. Now we don't memorize anything. Even when I grew up, we were still memorizing things, and I remember things that I memorized when I was in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th grade. I think that's already gone completely, and children no longer memorize the way we once did. But in the Middle Ages, here it's documented, not only Jews used methods for memorization, the entire world had it developed, and we have books in Christian Spain, Christian Europe, about how to memorize large bodies of knowledge. And there are whole books written on how to organize your your knowledge and how to memorize it, one of the ways in which they develop is to imagine a big building with many stories and many apartments on each one. And then in each one you put a certain item of knowledge, right? And then by memorizing where you put it all, it's still a little hard for me to to comprehend it, but this is what they discuss. This is how they were able to memorize large bodies of knowledge. In any case, the methodology of oral teaching and oral and memorization continued for a very long time. And the Rambam says that Afal Pisha Lo Nichteva, that's line 12. Just before that, we didn't finish the line 10 we were discussing. Great Torah Shabal Peh. Torah Shabal Peh, right. Afal Pi, I'm on line 12 now. Afal Pi Shelo Nichteva Torah Shabal Peh Limda Moshe Rabbeinu Kula B'Beit Dino L'Shivim Zkenim. He taught it to the Bezdin, to the Sanhedrin. Elazar Pinchas Yoshua. Shlashtan Kidlu Mi Moshe. Yoshua was the Talmid Muvhak, and Moshe basically appointed him as his continuer. And Yoshua continued to teach it Ba'al Peh. Then it was the Kainim, line 15. It was Kainim Rabim Kidlu Mi Yoshua. He passed it on to a group of Kainim. And the Rambam starts, I didn't list the entire Shalshel Kabbalah here, he passed it on to Pinchas, to Shmuel, to David, to Achia Hashiloni, which is a very interesting problem in itself, how long Achia Hashiloni could have lived, because he was Miotzei Mitzrayim, and he was still alive at the time of David HaMelech. That's a separate issue in itself. And then I skipped the text. I didn't provide you the entire Shalshelet HaKabbalah. Whoever's interested should open up the Mishnah Torah. And we're now, in line 19, we get down to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. After the Rambam provides this whole Shalshelet, and he names everybody in that chain of tradition. In other words, he goes through all the generations and mentions who received from whom. In other words, he doesn't say, oh, it just was passed down. No, he counts every single generation and names who was continued. In other words, to show the authenticity of Torah Shabal Peh. Torah Shabal Peh, he's emphasizing here, was not invented. It wasn't invented by the Chachamim. It wasn't invented by the Tanaim and Moraim. It's a genuine oral tradition, and I can point to every single generation in that chain of tradition that received and continued and taught, etc., etc. This was very important for the Rambam in order to defend the authenticity of Torah Shabal Peh. Who did the Rambam have to defend the authenticity of Torah Shabal Peh? Against whom?
It was a group of Karaites.
The Karaites. The Karaites of the time was a group that started already in the 9th, 10th century who denied the validity of Torah Shabal Peh. So in the back of the Rambam's mind in many places here is, I have to establish the authenticity of Torah Shabal Peh because the Karaites claim you made it up.
They still deny it.
Right. Yeah. You made it up. You made it up. You invented it all. Where did it come from? So for the Rambam, defending its authenticity was very important, and that's why he listed every link in that tradition. Yes?
2 questions.
Yes.
How successful were the Karaites in the beginning, and where were they located?
The Karaites were rather successful. Geographically, they were certainly in Egypt. They were, I think, in North Africa as well. They were also in Spain, because there's a lot of anti-Karaitic. By the way, the Karaites weren't only destructive, because the Karaites focused on, they believed in the written Torah. They just denied the oral Torah. But because they believed the written Torah, they concentrated very, very meticulously on interpreting the Torah, and the Ibn Ezra quotes them. The Ibn Ezra will quote them. When they come up with a correct interpretation of the pasuk, he didn't hesitate to quote them.
Right now there's a Karaite shul in the old city.
Yeah, all right, but that's that doesn't relate. We're talking about the Karaites then who were knowledgeable. I mean, there were some very knowledgeable Karaites.
They only came from Sparta.
What?
Are they Jews the one that nowadays or not anymore?
Nowadays, I don't know. I'm a medievalist. Yes.
So they came from out of Sparta.
I'm sorry?
They came out of Sparta.
They were, I don't know too much about the geographical locations of the Karaites, but they were in Spain and they were in I think originally they were in the Middle East, actually. That's where it started. Yes.
Yeah, the way of teaching through memorization, how many people were able to memorize?
That is a very, very good question.
What was the question?
The question is, how many people were able to memorize this? How they go about it?
Okay, so we're used to a situation.
I have a bad memory. That's why.
We're used to a situation of universal literacy, but that wasn't always the case. And the truth of the matter is, in early times, at the time of the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Gaonim, and the Rishonim, when, particularly before the printing press, there were relatively few learned Jews. I mean, relatively compared to the entire population, but they were a small percentage. Now, Jews received their instruction from the Rabbanim, so they would have shiurim and halacha and shiurim and Torah, but to what extent these people who heard the shiurim were able to retain, I don't know. That's a big. In other words, the great Chachamim mastered it. I mean, for example, if you see the Rambam or the Ramban's, you look at the Ramban's Parish on the Torah, it's constantly using phrases from all over Tanakh. Now, the Ramban didn't have a concordance, and he didn't have a digital copy of the Torah, but he had in his memory, at his fingertips, the entire Tanakh Be'al Peh, completely. And you go there, and the Rabbi Shavel, who put out an edition of the Ramban, every 2 or 3 lines, he notes, where did the Ramban take this phrase? Sometimes he uses a biblical phrase, and there are thousands of footnotes of Rabbi Shavel of where the Ramban got it. So the great scholars knew it all. They really mastered it. How, I don't know. How, I don't know. Because my memory is also our memory. I think today is not the way when you don't exercise memory and you rely on your computer, and you don't have to remember it because you just and you get the Barilan digital base and also a Chachman, it's all there, and you get it right away without 2 seconds. You don't have to make any effort. So I think that our memories have a somewhat shrunk.
There are some rabbis that I know who have fantastic.
Oh yes.
Memorize the whole Torah.
Correct.
All the Tehillim.
Right.
All the davening.
Shas. There are legendary Talmidei Chachamim that if you put a pin in a Gemara and stop at a certain point, they'll tell you what word it stopped at on that daf, and it hits a certain daf. It hits daf kaf. They'll tell you what word is under that point in the thing or whatever. Those are, I don't know if they're legendary or they're real, but there are people who master completely and know Bucky in Shas, not only Tanakh but in Shas. Yes.
Also, I don't know. I heard there are some that if you give them a phrase, they'll start with that phrase and go backwards.
Okay, all kinds of things.
Oh.
Correct. Yes.
Oh, my grandfather he memorized the whole Tanakh.
I believe it.
And the way he learned English was he got a copy of the King James Version of the Bible, and he learned his English. He locked himself in the hotel for a few months, and he came out speaking King's English.
King James English, yeah. No, I know it. My father was a Hebrew teacher. He was a linguist, and he had the hexaglot. Hexaglot was the Tanakh translated into 6 languages, parallel, and he taught himself Arabic and Latin and Greek and v'chule on that basis. So there are scholars that know how to do it. And I don't know how fluent he was in the other languages, but he was knowledgeable enough to be able to compare how one translation compares to the other and what was done there. Okay, so that's the issue of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Where are we?
22.
22, yes. V'chein, kol echad v'echad kotev latzmo kafi kocho. In other words, even though Torah Sheba'al Peh remained Ba'al Peh, people did take notes. In other words, it's not that nobody took notes. People took notes. The only thing was that none of these notes became an official document. In other words, people realized that they won't remember everything, so they wrote notes, they wrote Rashi Prakim, whatever, each one according to his own capabilities. But those written notes never became an official document of any type. Kotev kafi kocho. Incidentally, the Rambam uses that phrase, kafi kocho, in dozens of places throughout his halachic works, emphasizing the fact that in many areas, a person has to try to the best of his ability, but sometimes certain things are beyond his ability. And that's a crucial phrase in all of the Rambam's writings. Okay.
Compilation of the notes?
What?
Is there a compilation of the notes? Have they been compared with each other?
No, we're talking about thousands of years ago. We don't have any, because already by the time of the Gaonim, Torah Sheba'al Peh was written down. So we don't have these notes. Nothing survived from those. No manuscripts survived from those periods. We don't have any ancient manuscripts. It's all as it all disappeared. Okay. Okay, so he would take notes and write notes on how to explain all of these laws that he learned from the Torah. Here's Rambam's adding something, that indeed there was a reliable tradition, but in each generation there were new interpretations and new understandings. In other words, study of Torah was not a frozen body of knowledge. It was an organic body of knowledge, and there were new interpretations. We have chidushay Torah, right? We have new ways of explaining and new ways of understanding. So midvarim shenitchadshu b'chol dor v'dor. And here he refers to 2 types of Torah Sheba'al Peh in the following sentence. B'dinim shelo lemadum mipi hashmuah ela b'midah b'13 midot v'skimu alehem beit din hagadol v'chein haya davar tamid ad Rabbeinu HaKadosh. We have a methodology of deriving new halachot from the text. And that's called the 13 midot shatorah nidreshet bahem. 13 midot. In other words, Chazal, we have by tradition methodological principles like Kal Vachomer, for example, of how to derive a new halachot from the text. The question, of course, we're not going to discuss now is whether these are Doraita, these are Darabanan, but in any case, Chazal, Chachamim were always thinking about Torah, thinking about its implications, and drawing new material all the time. And that's why the Rambam emphasizes Dvarim shenitchadshu b'chol dor v'dor. Torah wasn't stagnant. Torah was productive. Torah was always moving. V'chein haya davar ad Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu HaKadosh is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, right? And here you have a turning point in the history of Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is the major turning point of all of Torah Sheba'al Peh, what Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, what Rabbeinu HaKadosh did. And what did he do? Line 25. V'hu kibeitz kol hashmuot v'chol hadinim v'chol habeurim v'haperushim sheshamu Moshe Rabbeinu. He put together all of the laws that were passed down, and he categorizes Shmuot and Dinim and Beurim and Perushim, different legal levels, and he collected everything. Vishalemdu beitin shilachol dor. Not only those that originated with Moshe Rabbeinu, but also the chidushim that he referred to in the previous paragraph. Those two he also put together. V'chiber mehakol sefer HaMishnah. He put together all of Torah Sheba'al Peh into the book of the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi produced here is basically a concise statement of all of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, now I emphasize two words. It's a concise, because afterwards the Gemara expands on it, but it's a concise statement of all of Torah Sheba'al Peh. In other words, according to the Rambam, what we have in the Mishnah is all of Torah Sheba'al Peh in its most concise form. This is what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi succeeded in doing, and he included in that also the new Perushim that Chachamim developed from, thank you, that Chachamim developed. Now, there's a major disagreement among the Gaonim and then the Rishonim exactly what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did. Did Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi write down the Mishnah, or did he edit a Mishnah which they continue to learn Ba'al Peh? And here there's a sharp divide between the tradition in Spain, in Sfarad, and the tradition in Ashkenaz. According to the Rambam, it's based upon, you know that the most important history of Torah Sheba'al Peh was Yigeret Rosh Shiragon. Rosh Shiragon was one of the Gonim, and somebody wrote Rosh Shiragon a letter, and they asked him, how is Torah Sheba'al Peh produced? And Rosh Shiragon writes a very detailed account of the tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh, part of which the Rambam relies on and takes from the Yigeret Rosh Shiragon. Now, in Yigeret Rosh Shiragon, you would know there are two girsot. There's the Ashkenaz girsa and the Sfarad girsa. According to the Sfarad girsa, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wrote down the Mishnah. According to the Ashkenaz girsa, he edited the Mishnah, but he didn't write it down. Okay? There's no big nafkamina for us right now, but it's interesting that you have these two parallel traditions, and you notice that the Rambam emphasizes here in line 26, V'chiber me'akol sefer HaMishnah v'shineno b'rabim. He taught it publicly, v'nigleh l'chol Yisrael, u'ktavuhu kulam. And they all wrote down the Mishnah. And according to the Rambam, everybody had a written copy of the Mishnah already at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. According to the Ashkenazic approach, he didn't write anything down. Everybody memorized it. And the Amoraim afterwards, they all memorized it. And even Ravina, to the time of Ravina Ravashi, who are the Sof Horah, who finally completed the Talmud Bavli, according to the Rambam, everything was being written down. According to the Ashkenazic approaches, it remained Ba'al Peh perhaps for another 200 years. In other words, even after the Chatimat Talmud, there's substantial proof to show that Torah Sheba'al Peh still remained Torah Sheba'al Peh until the beginning of the 8th century, which is incredible. Yes?
So how is determined which methodology becomes the dominant way of approaching things?
You mean whether it was written or whether it was Ba'al Peh? Listen, we can't go back and reconstruct what happened during the time of the Amorai. But in other words, were they working from written texts or were they working from Ba'al Peh? But there's an important scholar in Yerushalayim today, Yaakov Zussman, retired from Hebrew University. He had a stroke recently, so it's not functioning very well now. But he wrote an incredible, well, it was an article, but it was actually a book size. It was a 175-page article. So then they turned it into a book. After it was published as an article, they turned it into a book with, and he argues, based upon dozens, maybe hundreds of sources throughout the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi, that everything remained Ba'al Peh. And there are, in this article, this is an incredible article, because in one place, he gathers all the Makoros and Chazal that talk about the tremendous effort that was required in Talmud and learning Torah, and day and night and heat and cold and whatever, like they were moser nefesh physically for, and that implies a tremendous effort to continue to memorize all of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So his claim, based upon sources in the Gemara, that everything actually remained Ba'al Peh. But for us, it's really not so much a naftamina. And we still take it as an authentic tradition, whether it was memorized or not memorized. In any case, by the beginning of the 8th century, it's written. Okay, so we can move, and some claim that maybe a little bit before, maybe the 7th century, the middle of the 7th century, but from then on, we have texts. Although that's an issue in itself, the authenticity of every girsa. Okay, so let me just finish this this sentence here. Okay, when we continue, I'm not sure what the schedule will be, we'll continue with line 28 about how Rabbeinu HaKadosh did it and what happens afterwards. And anyhow, there's a story here that the Rambam tells, which is very interesting. And we'll continue with that in Mir Hashem.